"If you make this crop duster fly, I'll give the farm to your son." The words were shouted over the dry, dusty wind of a Nebraska afternoon, a cruel joke disguised as a wager. The man laughing was Silas Bull Miller, a 60-year-old landowner who controlled half the county's corn production. He was a giant of a man, both in stature and in ego, standing with his hands on his hips, looking down at a young woman named Clary O'Neill. Clary was 30, a single mother and a freelance aircraft mechanic who lived in a small trailer on the edge of town with her 10-year-old son, Toby. She was wiping her hands on a rag, her face streaked with grease and determination, standing in the shadow of a machine that looked less like an airplane and more like a skeleton. But before we see if Clary can pull off a miracle and change her son's life forever, I have to ask, where in the world are you watching this story from? Are you in the United States? Maybe somewhere in Europe? Or another part of the globe? Drop a comment below and let us know. And tell me this, have you ever been given an impossible challenge by someone who wanted to see you fail, only to use their doubt as your fuel? Let's build a community that turns impossible into done. The object of the bet was a 1978 Air Tractor AT301, a legendary American crop duster known for its ruggedness. But this particular plane, tail number N4598, had been grounded for 5 years. It sat in the corner of Bull Miller's hangar, covered in bird droppings and missing its propeller. Its radial engine, a Pratt & Whitney R1340, was rumored to be seized solid. Miller had bought it cheap at an auction for parts, stripped what he needed for his newer turbine planes, and left the carcass to rot. He had only called Clary because his regular mechanic was in the hospital, and he had a desperate need to get his other planes serviced for the upcoming spraying season. He saw Clary not as a professional, but as a desperate local girl, looking for scraps. "Well," Bull goaded, gesturing to the broken plane, "you said you could fix anything with wings. Prove it. You get that heap in the air by sunset tomorrow, and I'll sign the deed to the Old Creek property over to your boy. It's useless to me anyway, just rocks and weeds, but if you fail, you service my entire fleet for free for the rest of the season. Do we have a deal?" It was a predator's bet. The Creek property wasn't prime farmland, but it was 5 acres of land. Something Clary could never afford on her own. It was a future for Toby, but the risk was enormous. Free labor for a season would bankrupt her. Clary looked at the plane. She looked at Toby, who was sitting on her toolbox playing with a toy airplane. Then she looked at Bull Miller. "Deal," she said, her voice steady, "but I need access to your parts bin. Anything that came off this plane originally." Bull laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. "Help yourself, honey. It's all junk anyway. Clock's ticking." He walked away, chuckling to himself, confident he had just secured free labor for the next 3 months. Clary didn't waste a second. She walked over to the plane. The AT301 is a simple, honest machine, built for hard work. But an aircraft that has sat for 5 years is a minefield of potential failures. The first and biggest hurdle was the engine. A radial engine that sits, invites oil to seep into the lower cylinders, causing hydraulic lock. If you try to start it without clearing the oil, you'll bend a connecting rod and destroy the engine instantly. Bull Miller knew this. He was counting on her to be in a hurry, to try and crank it and blow it up. She grabbed a ladder and climbed up to the nose. She removed the cowling. The massive engine stared back at her, a complex radial arrangement of 9 cylinders. It was filthy. She didn't try to turn the prop. Instead, she removed the bottom spark plugs from the lower cylinders. As she unscrewed the last one, a thick, black sludge of oil and preservative fluid poured out. Hydraulic lock. Bull had been right about the condition, but wrong about her approach. She let it drain. Then, she manually rotated the crankshaft using a special tool she had brought, slowly, gently, feeling for any resistance. The engine turned. It was stiff, but it wasn't seized. That was the first victory. But the engine was just the heart. The nervous system, the magnetos that provide the spark, was the next problem. Magnetos are mechanical generators. If they sit, their internal magnets lose strength and their points corrode. She pulled both magnetos. On her portable test bench in the back of her truck, they produced a weak yellow spark. Not enough to fire a cylinder under compression. She didn't have new ones and she couldn't afford them. But she knew a trick her father, an old bush pilot mechanic in Alaska, had taught her. She disassembled the magnetos, cleaned the points with a diamond file, and then flashed the internal magnets using a strong DC current from her truck battery to realign their magnetic fields. It was an old-school field repair, not something you'd find in a modern manual. When she tested them again, the spark was blue, fat, and loud. Snap, snap, snap. Fire was restored. The sun began to set on the first day. Clary hadn't stopped for food or water. Toby had fallen asleep on a pile of clean rags. Bull Miller stopped by on his way home, expecting to see her defeated. Instead, he saw the engine, reassembled, fresh oil in the tank, and Clary working under the instrument panel with a headlamp. "Still at it?" he sneered. "You know, there's no shame in quitting. Go home to your kid." "I am home," Clary muttered, not looking up. "I'm just renovating." The next morning brought the real nightmare. The fuel system. The hopper, the tank that holds the chemicals, was fine, but the fuel tanks in the wings were a disaster. The old avgas had turned into a varnish that clogged everything. The fuel selector valve was stuck frozen. Clary spent 4 hours in the suffocating heat of the hangar, arms deep inside the wing access panels, scrubbing, flushing, and rebuilding the selector valve. She used guitar strings to clean the tiny orifices of the carburetor. It was tedious, microscopic work. One speck of dirt could kill the engine in flight. And in this bet, flying meant taking off and landing safely. By noon, she had fuel, she had spark, and she had compression. But she was missing the most obvious piece, the propeller. Bull had said she could use the parts bin. She found the original propeller in a corner, buried under old tires. It was a 3-blade Hartzell, but it was in pieces. The hub was disassembled. Rebuilding a constant-speed propeller is a job for a specialized shop, requiring hydraulic presses and balancing equipment. Clary didn't have a shop. She had a hangar floor. She laid out the parts. The seals were dried out. The grease had hardened into wax. She carefully cleaned every bearing. She used hydraulic fluid from the farm's tractor supply to lubricate the seals. She assembled the hub, using the weight of the farm's forklift to press the bearings into place, a risky, improvised move that would have given an FAA inspector a heart attack, but it was the only way. Then came the balancing. She mounted the prop on a static balancing stand she improvised from a jack stand and a level. She used duct tape and washers to temporarily find the heavy spots, then carefully filed away metal from the internal counterweights until the massive blades hung perfectly still in any position. It was an intuitive, artistic process, feeling the balance rather than measuring it with a laser. It was 4 p.m., 3 hours until sunset. The plane was assembled. It looked rough. The paint was still faded, the canopy was hazy, but mechanically, Clary knew it was sound. She wheeled it out onto the tarmac. Bull Miller drove up in his pickup truck, a crowd of his farmhands, and pilots gathering to watch the show. They were expecting a comedy. "Ready to give up?" Bull shouted, leaning out his window. "Or are you going to try to start that lawnmower?" Clary ignored him. She did her walk around. She checked the oil one last time. She strapped herself into the cockpit. She looked at Toby, who was standing by the hangar door, giving her a thumbs up. She put on her headset. "Clear prop," she yelled. She engaged the starter. The propeller turned. Whir, whir, whir. The engine cranked, coughing white smoke. It sputtered, then died. The crowd laughed. Bull shook his head. "Told you. Junk." Clary adjusted the mixture control. She primed it again. "Come on, old girl," she whispered. "Do it for Toby." She hit the starter again. Whir, 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 bang. The engine caught. A massive cloud of blue smoke erupted, followed by the deep, chest-thumping roar of the R1340 radial. It settled into a loping, rhythmic idle, potato, 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 the sound of American horsepower. The laughter stopped. The prop blurred into a silver disc. Clary watched the gauges. Oil pressure, green, cylinder head temp, rising, fuel pressure, steady. She cycled the propeller pitch. The engine note changed as the blades bit into the air. It was working. She taxied to the end of the dirt strip. The plane bounced and rattled, but the engine pulled strong. She lined up with the runway. She pushed the throttle forward. The roar became a deafening howl. The tail lifted off the ground. The plane accelerated. The crowd held its breath. Bull Miller's cigar fell out of his mouth. And then, gently, gracefully, The dusty, battered air tractor lifted off the ground. It climbed into the orange sky of the Nebraska sunset, banking sharply to the left. Clary didn't just fly it straight. She did a low pass over the hangar, dipping her wings in a salute, the radial engines singing a song of victory. She flew a perfect circuit and greased the landing, the wheels touching down with a puff of dust. She taxied back to the crowd and shut down the engine. The silence was absolute. She climbed out, her legs shaking slightly, not from fear but from adrenaline. She walked over to Bull Miller. He was staring at the plane, then at her. His face was pale. He knew aviation. He knew what he had just seen. He had seen a master mechanic resurrect the dead in 36 hours. "The deed," Clary said, holding out her hand. "And a pen." Bull Miller stared at Clary's outstretched hand. For a moment, the silence. Stretched so thin it felt like it might snap. The farmhands, who usually echoed their boss's every mood, were quiet, looking at the ground or at the miraculous plane cooling on the tarmac. Bull was a hard man, a man who bullied his way through business deals, but he was also a man of the Old West code. A bet was a bet. His reputation, the only thing he valued as much as his money, hung in the balance. He reached into his truck's glove box and pulled out a folded document and a pen. It wasn't the deed itself, but a preliminary transfer agreement he had prepared as a joke, thinking he would never have to sign it. He scrawled his signature at the bottom, the pen digging deep into the paper. He ripped it off the pad and slapped it into Clary's hand. "You got lucky," he grunted, his face red. "That engine will probably blow up tomorrow. But a deal's a deal. The rocks and weeds are yours." Clary took the paper. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. And about that service contract for your fleet, my rates just went up." She turned and walked toward Toby, who ran into her arms. "You did it, Mom. You made it fly." But the story didn't end with a handshake and a piece of land. As Clary drove away that evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, she knew she had won a battle, but the war was just beginning. The creek property Bull had disparaged was indeed rocky and overgrown. It was 5 acres of scrubland with a small, dilapidated barn and a seasonal creek that flooded every spring. To Bull, it was useless for corn, but Clary saw something else. She didn't want to farm corn. She wanted to build an airstrip, not a big commercial one, but a small specialized strip for restoration and maintenance of vintage agricultural aircraft. There were hundreds of old crop dusters rotting in barns all over the Midwest because modern shops wouldn't touch them. They were too analog, too dirty, too unsafe. Clary knew that these machines were the backbone of American farming history, and she knew she could fix them. Using the land as collateral, she secured a small business loan. It was a terrifying risk. If she failed, she would lose the land Toby's future depended on. She spent the next 6 months working 18-hour days. She cleared the brush, leveled a grass runway, and patched the roof of the old barn, turning it into a hangar. She called her business O'Neill Aero Restoration. Her first customer wasn't a stranger. It was one of Bull Miller's own pilots, a man named Jim. He came to her secretly flying his personal plane, an old Piper Cub that had a nagging engine vibration. "Bull would fire me if he knew I was here," Jim said. "But I saw what you did with that air tractor. Can you help me?" Clary fixed the vibration, a misaligned alternator bracket, in an hour. Jim told his friends. Word of mouth in the aviation community is faster than radar. Soon, Clary had a lineup of old Stearmans, Cessnas, and air tractors parked on her grass strip. But the real turning point came in the spring when the creek flooded. The water rose higher than usual, threatening the foundation of her new hangar. Clary was out in the rain, digging trenches to divert the water, when she noticed something odd about the rocks Bull had laughed about. The heavy rain had washed away the topsoil on the creek bank, exposing a vein of grey, clay-like material. It wasn't just rock. She took a sample and sent it to a geological lab, mostly out of curiosity. The report came back 2 weeks later. The useless rocks were actually a high-grade deposit of bentonite clay, a valuable mineral used in everything from drilling mud to foundry sands. But more specifically, this particular vein was incredibly pure, suitable for high-end industrial filtration, including aviation fuel filtration. Bull Miller had been sitting on a literal gold mine and hadn't known it because he only cared about what could grow on the soil, not what was under it. Clary didn't sell the mining rights. That would destroy her. Land. Instead, she realized she had a unique resource. She could use the clay to create a natural, localized filtration system for her shop's runoff, making her the only green certified restoration shop in the state. It was a marketing hook that attracted a new kind of client, the wealthy, eco-conscious collectors from the cities. One afternoon, a sleek, twin-engine King Air landed on her grass strip. It was out of place among the crop dusters. A man stepped out, dressed in a flight suit, but with the bearing of a corporate executive. "I'm looking for Clary O'Neill," he said. "I'm Clary. My name is Arthur Vance," he said. A distant cousin of the Arthur Vance from the Nissan story, perhaps, or just a shared name in the universe of car-plane enthusiasts. "I represent the Heritage Flight Museum in Washington, D.C. We have a 1930s Ford Tri-Motor that has been grounded for a decade. We can't find anyone who knows how to time the radial engines correctly. We heard about the crop duster. Whisperer in Nebraska. The contract to restore the Ford Tri-Motor was huge. It put O'Neill Aero on the national map. Clary hired 2 assistants, Jim, who had quit working for Bull, and a young apprentice from the local trade school. Meanwhile, Bull Miller was struggling. His modern fleet of turbine crop dusters was plagued by electronic sensor failures that his laptop mechanics couldn't diagnose. The manufacturer had a 6-week backlog for service. His crops were waiting to be sprayed. The pests were eating his profits. He was losing money hand over fist. Desperate and swallowing his massive pride, Bull drove his truck down the road to the property he had given away. He stopped at the gate. The useless scrubland was now a manicured airfield with a bustling hangar. He saw the sign, "O'Neill Aero Restoration. We keep history flying." He walked into the hangar. Clary was up on a scaffold, working on the massive wing of the Ford Tri-Motor. She looked down. "Hello, Bull. Here to check." "On the weeds." Bull took off his hat. "Clary, Ms. O'Neill, I have 3 planes grounded, sensor faults. My guys can't figure it out. I'm losing 20,000 a day. I need help." Clary wiped her hands. She could have turned him away. She could have laughed. He had tried to humiliate her. He had bet against her. But she looked at Toby, who was now 11, helping Jim organize tools. She looked at the business she had built. She didn't need revenge. She needed to prove a point. "I can fit you in," she said calmly, "but my rate is double for emergency calls, and I need you to do something for me." "Anything," Bull said. "I need you to sponsor a scholarship at the local trade school, for girls, specifically for girls who want to be mechanics, and I want your name on it so everyone knows you support it." Bull looked at her. He realized he had been beaten not just in mechanics, but in character. "Done," he said. Clary drove to Bull's farm the next day. She didn't bring a computer. She brought her oscilloscope and her father's old multimeter. The modern turbine crop dusters were complex, but Clary understood that sensors are just analog devices trying to talk to a digital brain. The problem, she quickly found, wasn't the sensors. It was the grounding. The high-static environment of crop dusting, flying low, generating friction with the air and the spray, was building up massive static charges on the airframes. The factory grounding straps, designed for normal flight, weren't sufficient for the dry, dusty Nebraska air. The static was creating noise that confused the delicate flight computers. She didn't replace parts. She fabricated new, heavy-duty grounding cables from braided copper she had in her shop. She bonded the spray booms to the chassis more effectively. It was a simple physics-based solution that the factory engineers in their air-conditioned offices hadn't anticipated. In 4 hours, she had all 3 planes running perfectly. Bull Miller watched her work. He saw the efficiency, the confidence. He realized that the junk plane he had bet against was just a test, a filter that had separated a true mechanic from a parts changer. "You know," Bull said as she packed up, "that air tractor, the one you fixed, I should have never let it rot. It was a good machine." "It still is," Clary said. "I fly it every Sunday. It's Toby's favorite." The scholarship fund, the Miller O'Neill Grant for Women in Aviation, became a huge success. It changed the culture of the local trade school. Girls who had been told mechanics was boys' work now had a path and a role model. 5 years later, Clary's hangar was a destination. Pilots flew in from all over the country for her radial engine clinics. She had expanded the runway. She had built a small museum in the front of the hangar, showcasing the history of agricultural aviation. And in the center of that museum, polished to a mirror shine, sat the 1978 air tractor AT-301. The plaque in front of it didn't list its horsepower or its spray capacity. It read, "The Miller Bet." This aircraft was grounded by neglect and resurrected by determination, proof that the only thing that can't be fixed is a closed mind. One sunny afternoon, an airshow was held at O'Neill Aero. The star attraction wasn't a military jet or a stunt plane. It was Clary, flying the air tractor. She took off, the radial engine roaring that deep, nostalgic song. She performed a demonstration of crop dusting passes, using water, flying low and fast, pulling up sharply at the end of the field, the plane dancing in her hands. On the ground, Toby, now 16 and learning to fly, stood next to an older, slower Bull Miller. "She's one hell of a pilot," Bull admitted, shielding his eyes from the sun. "She's a better mechanic," Toby corrected him with a grin. "Yeah," Bull chuckled. "She is. And she's a better businessman than me, too." She turned a pile of rocks into a gold mine. Clary landed, taxiing the yellow plane up to the crowd. She climbed out, taking off her helmet, her hair shaking loose. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't a millionaire mogul in a suit. She was still Clary, wearing grease-stained coveralls. But she owned her land, she owned her time, and she owned the respect of an entire industry. The story of the crop duster bet became a modern parable in the aviation world. It wasn't just about fixing an engine. It was about the value of sweat equity, of seeing potential where others see waste. It was a reminder that the shiny, new computerized way isn't always the only way, and that sometimes the old iron just needs someone who speaks its language. Clary never sold the bentonite rights, but she did use the clay. She packaged it in small boutique tins as O'Neill Mechanics hand soap, a gritty, natural cleaner that removed grease better than anything else. It became a cult product among mechanics, another steady stream of income from the land she was told was worthless. So, as we finish this story, I ask you one final time. Where are you watching from? What is the pile of junk in your life that you've been ignoring? Is it an old skill, a forgotten project, or maybe a piece of land everyone says is useless? Let me know in the comments below. Because Clary O'Neill proved that value isn't something you find, it's something you create. Let's build a community that isn't afraid to get its hands dirty to find the gold underneath. Together.